The title of our message this morning, Job chapter 24, verses 1 to 25, Job's eighth speech, part 2. Last week we looked at part 1, chapter 23. And now our introduction. The doctrine of retribution is the driving theme of the speeches from each of Job's three friends. Job has previously addressed this controversy of the doctrine of retribution, but in this chapter he seeks to put this doctrine into its proper perspective. Job has agreed with his friends that some wicked people get exactly what they deserve immediately, and some feel the wrath of God slowly. But Job and his three friends disagree about the extent of this punishment. The three friends argue that the demise of the wicked is always imminent. It's either happened or it's going to happen very soon. While Job argues that there is a class of wicked persons who escape earthly justice. These wicked are not punished until they have died and meet God's justice. Here Job argues that while most of the wicked are punished in a timely manner, some of the wicked escape earthly punishment. They're of course punished when they die, but some go right to their death and they escape punishment from God. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 12, the outward prosperity of the wicked. Verses 13 to 17, the wicked often go undiscovered and unpunished by God. And then verses 18 to 25, God's punishment takes 3 forms, according to Job, not 2, as his friends say. Our context. Job now makes his case that wickedness has and always will thrive. When, he asks, has the world ever been rid of murderers, thieves, pirates, and tyrants, he asks. Job argues that many wicked people live at ease that are both ungodly and profane. Now here Job expands on his former arguments and argues that many wicked persons who live in open defiance to all the laws of justice and common honesty thrive and succeed in their unrighteous practices. And we do not always see them reckoned with by God in this world. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 12. Job speaks of the outward prosperity of the wicked. Verse 1, and this is the key to the other 12 verses, so we'll spend some time with it. Verse 1, Job asks, how should not the times be hid from the Almighty, seeing that they which know him see not his days? Did they get bulletins? Did you guys get bulletins? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that, guy. Start over. Verse 1. Sorry about that. How should not the times be hid from the Almighty, seeing that they which know him see not his days? Job begins by showing what great harm the doctrine of retribution does to the providential will of God. Job's friends were certain that every wicked person was either currently being judged by God or would be very soon. Job argues that the times of God's judgment are known only to God. When God chooses to judge, it is always in his perfect time. While none escape his judgment, many, argues Job, have their judgment delayed until death. Job does not believe mankind can know why God makes one person suffer immediately for their sins, and with others he is more long-suffering. Nevertheless, says Job, all sins will be brought before the judge of all things. Job fears that the doctrine of retribution places the will of God in a man-made box. Job dislikes the idea that his friends limit the freedom of God's will, as well as interpret God's will according to their own invention, their own doctrine. This limited use of God's will, complains Job, causes his friends to misinterpret the secret will of God. Job notes that God is very aware of all sins in the universe, and which ones are to be judged and when. Every man's times, he said, are in God's hands and under his eye, and they are not hid, as the text says, from the Almighty. Therefore, it is in God's power and timing to determine when to make the times of wicked men in this world miserable. God foresees the times of every man's death, and therefore, if wicked men die before they are punished for their wickedness, they still do not escape the punishment of God. Job's friends do not need to make up a system to explain God's forestalled punishments. All the wicked will suffer, and God's punishment will exhibit perfect justice and timing. Job follows this first verse in verses 2 through 11 with a list of sins common to every generation. In other words, an evil that always is around. The sins listed never end and commonly go unpunished, even for a lifetime. And therefore, argues Job, just as some sinners escape God's wrath in their lifetime and suffer only at death, some blameless persons may suffer during their lifetimes, like himself, but receive God's blessing at death. While Job's friends might pretend to understand the mystery of providence, in truth, even the wisest and those who know God best do not yet see or know the master plan. And now we get to some of those sins, verses 2 through 4. Some remove the landmarks that rob the flocks and feed thereof. They lead away the ass of the fatherless and take the widow's ox to pledge. They make the poor to turn out of the way so that the poor of the earth hide themselves together. Now Job will describe the acts of wicked men that typically seem to escape the immediate wrath of God in every generation. In other words, we always have these types of people. Job begins by describing the actions of a tyrant. Biblically, a tyrant is one who manipulates the law in his favor in order to gain authority for his immoral, wicked deeds. By a misuse of God's law, the tyrant uses wicked man's law to steal land from their neighbors, or simply remove the landmarks, which is an action forbidden in Deuteronomy 19:4 and even placed under a curse in Deuteronomy 27:17. What happens is where under false pretenses, landmarks are removed and misplaced. In another example, if a poor fatherless boy, here in verse 3, has but one cow, they set their sights upon it and see how they might take it. Or, if a widow has but one ox, they invent some pretext, maybe a tax, in which to take it. And so she gives it as a pledge to pay her debt, and when she cannot repay the debt, they keep the whole ox. And so we see the powerful invent immoral rights, that's what a tyrant does, to cheat the poor. In other words, a tyrant would be a thief, but he has the law on his side. It's the only difference. To cheat the poor and turn them out of the way, which refers to taking their scant possessions for themselves. The powerless eventually learn to hide themselves from their leaders, for they fear the powerful will manipulate the law to eventually take everything they own. Some more sins, verses 5 through 8. Behold, others as wild asses in the wilderness go forth to their business and rise early for a prey. The wilderness giveth him and his children food. They reap his provision in the field, but they gather the late vintage of the wicked. They cause the naked to lodge without garments and without covering in the cold. They are wet with the showers of the mountains, and they embrace the rock for want of covering. Job earlier spoke of tyrants. Now Job speaks of robbers and those who do wrong by downright force, as the band of the Sabaeans and Chaldeans did when they stole all of Job's possessions, chapter 1. Character of these robbers is that they are as wild asses in the wilderness, meaning these men are untamed, hard to control, unreasonable, fierce, and furious. They are under no restraint of law or government. They choose the desert for their dwelling so that they might hide and come and act lawlessly. The desert is the best place for such wild people to escape justice. Their trade or job is to steal. It is their work because they reason that it is easier to steal than to make an honest living. They work hard at stealing. Notice they rise early for a prey. In other words, if a traveler is out early, they will be up early to rob him. The wilderness, you'll notice, not the ground where they should plant food and get their food, but the wilderness, it says, yieldeth food for them and their children, and for their children. In other words, instead of making a living off of tilling the ground, they make a living for their families by robbing along the highway. And consider their theft honest gain. They were clever thieves. They not only rob travelers, but they ride into the country and the towns and reap his provision in the field. In other words, where others have planted. We see here in verse 6. They enter upon other people's grounds, cut their corn, and carry it away as freely as if it was their own. They take the winter clothing and garments that protect the innocent and the poor from the weather, and so they freeze through the night. Notice it says they lodge without garments and without covering in the cold. And they are forced to spend the night in a cave. That's what it means when it says they're forced to embrace the rock for their want of covering. Embrace the rock is the cave where they have to go to warm themselves. Verse 9 to 12, more. We've seen the tyrant, we've seen the robber. 9 to 12, they pluck the fatherless from the breast and take the pledge of the poor. They cause him to go naked without clothing and take the gleaning from the hungry. They that make oil between their walls and tread their winepresses suffer thirst. Men cry out of the city, and the souls of the slain cry out, yet God doth not charge them with their folly, these sinful men. In other words, he doesn't always punish them right away. It says that they pluck the fatherless from the breast, that is, having made poor infants fatherless. They take the pledge of the poor, meaning they take the orphan from their mother and make them into slaves. They take the orphan and rob them of necessary food and winter clothing and expose them to the dangers of the cold, here in verses 9 and 10. And we're told that even if a poor, hungry family has gleaned a sheaf of corn to eat and save them from death, even that they take away. Notice it says they take the gleaning from the hungry, while they feed themselves fat and full. They also rob here by oppressing their workers. Their workers are probably those who owed them a debt, and they took their lives as a pledge. They not only give their workers no wages, it says, in order to pay off their debts, but they will not so much as feed them with the food that they pick. The weak gather food for the powerful who robs them so that they eat none of it. Furthermore, he says, those that make oil between their walls, in other words, the workers who work hard at the wine presses for their profit, suffer thirst. Verse 11. And this is not only done among the poor country people, but in the cities, we also see, where men cry out of the city, where the rich merchants and traders are as cruel with their poor debtors as the landlords in the countries are with their poor tenants. The souls of those robbed in cities groan, we're told, and cry out like wounded men. What does Job say about that? Yet God layeth not folly to them. He lets them get away with it. That is, he does not immediately prosecute them with his judgment for these crimes, nor make them examples, and so their wickedness continues for a time. So Job has made his first point. Wickedness abounds and goes largely unpunished by God. It doesn't always get punished immediately. We come to our second point, verses 13 through 17. The wicked often go undiscovered and unpunished by God. Now we deal with a different class of thieves, those that we don't even know are stealing or thieves. Verses 13 to 17, beginning at verse 13 and 14. These are they that abhor the light. They know not the ways thereof, nor continue in the paths thereof. The murderer riseth early and killeth the poor and the needy, and in the night he is as a thief. These verses here describe another sort of sinner, those who go unpunished because they go undiscovered. We're told that these wicked men abhor the light, meaning they rebel against the light of nature, the light of God's law, the light of their own conscience, and they also rebel against doing their wicked deeds in the light where they might be discovered. Their sinful works are therefore called works of darkness, because he that does evil hates the light. John 3:20. So that he here describes the worst of sinners, those that sin willfully and deliberately and with a great deal of plotting, who imagine that if they can hide their crimes from the eyes of men and never be caught, then they are safe. But forgetting, of course, that God sees and judges all. In these next verses, 14 through 16, Job specifies three sorts of sinners that shun the light. In other words, do all their work in the dark. Murderers, adulterers, and thieves. Verses 14 through 16. First, in verse 14, he notes the murderer. The murderer riseth early to kill the poor travelers that are up early and go to work, walking along the dark road. Even though they have little money, the murderer will take their life, because they will not stop short of even murder for a little profit. Verses 15, 16. The eye also of the adulterer waiteth for the twilight, and saith, None eye shall see me, and disguiseth his face. They dig through houses in the dark, which they marked for themselves in the day. They know not the light. The second sort of sinner that shuns the light in order to perform their wicked deeds is the adulterer. The adulterer waiteth for the twilight to work his wickedness under the cloak of darkness. Also in verse 16, the thief, who commit their crimes under the protection of night. They dig through houses in the dark, first plotting and planning which houses to rob. They plot their plans in the day, and then safely at night they rob the innocent while they sleep. But listen to what Job says, verse 17. But the morning is even to them as the shadow of death. If one know them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. Job notes that these three categories of the wicked, the murderer, the adulterer, and the thief, fear the day or fear the light as men fear death. They are in a continual terror for fear of being discovered. It says, the morning is even to them, or their deeds coming to light, is even to them as the shadow of death. The light of day, which is welcome to honest people, is a terror to wicked people. They curse the sun because it's under the sun that they are discovered. They are afraid of coming under the eye of men, but they have no fear of the dread of the eye of God, which is always upon them. They are not afraid of doing in the dark, which they do fear to do in the light in front of the eyes of men. So Job shows that there is a category of men who escape the punishment of men, because men don't even catch them. But man should not fear. God sees and punishes perfectly. And now we come to the final bit of his argument, verses 18 to 25, where he comes back to the doctrine of retribution, and he argues with his three friends that where they think God's punishment takes two forms, it's either immediate or very shortly, close to immediate. Job says, no, there's one other category, and that is they make it all the way to death, and then they're punished at the time of their death. And that's the example he's going to give here. Verse 18. Job here speaking of the swiftness of God's judgment. He says, He is swift upon the waters. Their portion shall be cursed in the earth. He will not behold the way of the vineyards. While Job has been making a strong case that the wicked often go unpunished in this life, he concludes his speech on a point of agreement. Job does not want to overstate his case. Like his friends, Job does believe that at times God swiftly punishes the wicked. And sometimes he punishes them slowly, at the height of their prosperity, and sometimes at the moment right before their death. So they go to the grave disgrace. Job agrees that God does use that form of punishment. He has observed swift and even slow judgment, as his friends have rightly argued. But Job means to show that his friends have ignored a third kind of judgment. The judgment that comes only at death. A judgment that the wicked never suffer in life. For Job, the wicked that prosper until the time of death are an exception to the doctrine of retribution. Job's point in all this is that if an exception exists in which the wicked can prosper until death, then Job might also be an exception to the rule that says the righteous always prosper before death. In other words, if in God's unknowable plans the wicked can prosper for an entire lifetime, it also stands to reason that God's plans might allow the righteous to suffer for a lifetime. Job now explains the three forms, not just the two that God's punishment might take. He starts by explaining his observance of God's swift punishment. Swift punishment does often happen to the wicked. Job agrees. And righteous men have observed the circumstances enough to see swift judgment with their own eyes. Therefore, Job will not deny, and he'll even affirm, that the wicked often meet with swift judgment. God often moves, he says, swift upon the water, like a fast boat, in order to pass quick sentence on the wicked. Job has seen remarkably quick judgment. The wicked's possessions and estates taken from them in an instant. That's what he means when he says, their portion shall be cursed in the earth. And their prosperity, by which he refers to their vineyards, left behind upon their quick death. Job agrees. Some of them die quick. Verse 19 and 20. Now Job talks about sometimes it's not quick. Sometimes it's a little slower. Verses 19 and 20. As the dry ground and heat consume the snow waters, so shall the grave the sinners. The pitiful man shall forget him. The worm shall feel his sweetness. He shall be no more remembered, and the wicked shall be broke like a tree. Having shown that sometimes the wicked are punished swiftly, Job now shows that at times they are punished slowly. He uses a metaphor. Just as snow might lie on the ground for an entire winter season, where eventually the warmth of spring will melt the snow to water, and as water might sit upon the ground for a long time, eventually the dry ground swallows it up. So, ungodly persons may prosper for a season, a period of time. But eventually, like the snow and the water, their fortune dries up. For instance, the tyrant often prospers for a season in verse 20. And those who oppress him for a time fear him greatly, maybe wondering when God will punish him. But eventually his reign does come to an end, and he is forgotten, and he is no longer feared in his death. And so the tyrant is an example of someone who prospered in life for a time, but as he fed upon the poor and weak, now he is food for the worm. That's what it says. For the worm shall feel his sweetness. He's food for the worm. He might have had an extended time in the sun, but eventually God says he will be broken like a tree. Thus Job has shown the second kind of punishment. The first being quick, the second being a little slower. Now he comes to the one that gets away with it, all the way to death. He doth entreat ye barren, that doeth not bear, neither doeth he good to the widow. He draweth also the mighty by his power, and when he riseth up, none is sure of life. Job has shown that at times God punishes swiftly and sometimes slowly. Now Job will show that at times God employs a third type of punishment, which does not punish at all until the time of death. And the wickedness of some of these men is very fierce. Notice what it says. They take advantage of those who are in misery. Even the most wicked sinners make it all the way to their death, before punishment. The barren woman is abused, as Peninnah, of course you remember, afflicted Hannah and Samuel. They exploit the widow who has no husband to protect them. And so the wicked are shown to pick on those who are in the most helpless state. Job's saying even the worst of them make it to death sometimes. The class of wicked sinners accumulates power over a long lifetime. These wicked persons merge with other wicked persons and form a powerful league together. Thus he makes himself more powerful by the use of his powerful friends to further afflict and bully the helpless. With all his power, he likes to make people afraid, so no one feels safe around him, or as the text says, none is sure of life. So, having surrounded himself with powerful friends, he lives a long life of sin. Verses 23 to 25. Though men give him assurance to be in safety, yet his eyes are upon their ways. They are exalted for a little or a lifetime, but they are gone, and are brought low as all others. They are destroyed and cut off as the top of an ear of corn. But if it not be so, Job boldly says, where is he? Or who will prove me a liar and make my words of no value? Job concludes by saying, it is God that allows the wicked man to exist in safety, maybe even for a lifetime. It is God that sustains him and allows the wicked to prosper for long periods of time. It is God's lack of punishment that might even give the wicked assurance of their safety. As the wicked see no response from God, they might see themselves as safe. Yet, says Job, the eyes of God are upon their wicked ways. It says his eyes are upon their ways. God foresees their fall, and that their death, though they die in ease and honor, will serve as their ruin. They did not lose their honor in life, but received the consequences of their sin at death, and not until death. Their life is all they get. It says they are exalted but for a little, for our lifespan compared to eternity is but a little. But at death, the honor which he got by sin will soon be turned into shame. As the ear of the corn is taken when it has reached its full maturity in years, it's a picture of the wicked dying at the end of their years, at death, so the wicked man may live a long and prosperous life, like the ear of corn. But like the corn, it is eventually consumed. And so Job argues that wicked people will at times suffer immediately. At times they will suffer slowly, but also at times they will suffer only after they die, but then they'll suffer for a miserable eternity. So Job here concludes with a bold challenge to his three friends. He asks him after his speech, who will prove me a liar? Job says, if all I say is true, which is that God allows the wicked to unjustly prosper until death at times, then it stands to reason God's plans must also allow for the innocent to suffer. Job's friends have been given a definitive argument to drop their stance that the wicked always suffer swift punishment and that the innocent who suffer are always under God's heavy wrath. Next week we'll look at Bildad's 6-verse speech and the last speech of all three friends. Let us pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, we do give Thee thanks for the sending of Thy Son, Jesus Christ, for the communication of Thy Holy Spirit. We give thanks for the Word of God as the means that communicates Thy special revelation unto us and brings light into our lives. We do give thanks for the gospel, for our election, for our adoption, for our justification, our sanctification. We do give thanks for our hope of heaven. We do pray from the preaching of the Word this morning that Thou would be pleased to free all of our land from unchristian doctrine and rebellion against Christ as rightful King. For we do pray for a reformation of religion in this land. We do pray that the gospel might go forth in great purity and power and with great liberty. We pray these things in Thy Son's name. Amen. Conclude our worship with the singing of Psalm 11, verses 1 to 7, to the tune of Choros. Psalm 11, verses 1 to 7, to the tune of Choros, where David says, if the righteous foundations of a wicked nation are destroyed, what should the righteous do? Like in our nation. But he says, don't worry, relax, because God sees all. He sees what the righteous do and He sees what the wicked do, and they'll all get due